I'm Lisa Stone. I am curator of the Roger Brown Study Collection of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Really bright lights on me instead of turning down the lights. So, okay. I don't know how to turn. Is that working? Oh, just like the rock stars. Okay. So, good evening and thank you for coming tonight. This is the second panel discussion on the occasion of the exhibition Roger Brown and Andy Warhol, Politics, Rhetoric, and Pop, on view at the Kavi Gupta Gallery at 219 Elizabeth Street location. The show inaugurates Kavi Gupta's representation of SAIC's Roger Brown estate most robustly. And I want to begin by thanking Kavi and his staff for all of the intelligence and resources that they've poured into this exhibition and to the three related panel discussions. So please note that the third discussion, which will delve into Roger Brown's work addressing aspects of sexuality, homosexuality, culture wars, and love, I think, is on Saturday, November 5th. So I know these are spoiler slides if you haven't seen the show, but I want to lure you all in to see it. Roger Brown has mostly been discussed and critiqued in the context of Chicago Imagist art over the years. The exhibition frames Brown through a distinctly different lens and is an exciting and in some ways challenging strategy to regard and enlarge thinking about Brown's work, his ideas, and his relationships to many aspects of the culture of his time. Kavi and his staff have poured a large measure of imagination into this project. Both Brown and Warhol were inveterate collectors, and there are interesting parallels and corollaries in their discoveries, their attractions, their acquisitions, and their arrangements. Kavi's team reconstituted 5 arrangements from Brown's La Conchita, California home, which illuminate the connection between Brown's gathering of objects and the process of distilling them into a major body of work, his 27 virtual still life object paintings. Brown had bequeathed his California home and collection to SAIC, and it lives mostly in storage, so it's a thrill to have these arrangements on view. And I'd also like to acknowledge Nick Lowe, who first reconstituted a number of the arrangements for the exhibition Roger Brown, Calif USA, at the Hyde Park Art Center in 2010. The show is on view through November 22nd, so don't miss it. And there are announcement cards and other things on the piano that you can take. But we're not here to talk about that. In works throughout his 30-year professional career, Brown addressed a broad range of subjects and issues, including, in no particular order, nature, the dichotomy of nature and culture, architecture, natural and cultural disasters, current events, popular culture, political culture, the art world, religion in many guises, autobiographical, personal, and sexual issues, cosmology, mortality, reality, history, mythology, transformation, transportation, infrastructure, the weather, and landscapes, to name a few. Landscapes including urban, suburban, exurban, cultural, historical, allegorical, and deeply spiritual landscapes. And also what we do to the landscape. He addressed environmental issues. Brown was rigorously engaged with the senses of place in his life, where he chose to live and work. We're privileged to have speakers who will delve into Brown's relationship to landscapes, to place, and to places. So I'm going to introduce our speakers all together now. They are actually here. They're in the audience, and after they give their presentations, they'll get up on stage and we'll discuss them. Before retiring in the spring of 2015, Greg Brown was an adjunct professor at Troy University in Montgomery, Alabama. He has a BFA in visual design from Auburn University and an MFA degree in painting and drawing from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, 1978. His work represents an interest in representative styles in lino cut prints and also a more instinctive abstract style with photomontage, papier-mâché sculptures. More recently, he's been making hypertufa masks influenced by Mesoamerican and Greek mythology and wire sculptures. And as Roger Brown's brother and the only remaining close relative who remained in the South, Greg has generously acted as our living archive and is eminently qualified to talk about place, particularly that place. Chloe Pelletier is a third-year PhD student in the art history department at the University of Chicago. Her research interests include landscape painting, painted architecture, and Renaissance resonances in modern art. She has written and presented on Roger Brown's interpretations of early Renaissance painting and is working on a dissertation project aimed at understanding the role of background imagery in Italian Renaissance painting. Chloe brings deep insights into aspects of Brown's work that are often glossed over. We were delighted to welcome her into our archive, and we appreciate her detailed, in-depth investigation into Brown's work. Russell Bowman served as the Director of Education at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago from 1978 to 1980. He then served as the Chief Curator from 1980 to 85 and Director from 85 to 2002 at the Milwaukee Art Museum. In 2002, Bowman founded the Russell Bowman Art Advisory, which provides complete collection development and management for private collectors, corporations, and institutions while specializing in modern, contemporary, and self-taught art. From 2002 to 2009, Bowman was a member of the Board of Governors of the David and Alfred Smart Museum of Art at the University of Chicago and was on the Board of Directors at Intuit, the Center for Intuitive and Outsider Art. He holds a BA from Randolph-Macon College and an MA in Modern Art from the University of Chicago. Russell was kind of there at the creation in the time period in Chicago art from which Roger Brown emerged and is an authority on Brown's work. He represented the Roger Brown estate for SAIC expertly from 2003 to 2015. So, Greg? Yep. Okay.
Hello, I'm Greg Brown. I'm here to talk a little about my brother and my relationship to him, and as much as I can about the southern subject matter of the paintings that you can see and what I know about that. So, first of all, we're starting with the photograph. This was taken about 1944. I think my brother would have been about 2.5 or 3 years old at that time. And my father was about to go into World War II. This is just before he left. Of course, that's when my mother in 1944. Incidentally, I still have the hat that my brother is wearing there. I have a pretty good collection. So the house in the background, I believe, is the house right across the street from my great-grandmother's house, where my mother and sister and 4 brothers grew up. She's known as Dizenia. And we'll be looking at autobiography in the Shape of Alabama that is about her, where she lived, and some other locations in the state of Alabama. Okay. Okay, speaking of autobiography in the Shape of Alabama, most of you may or may not be familiar with it, but I consider it his masterpiece painting. And as you see, it was done in 1974. My brother always maintained very close ties to Alabama, very close to his family. He spent years doing family research. It was 30 years of his life. Of course, that was before we had ancestral search computer things and things like that. He did the footwork and went to Salt Lake City and researched records all over the country. And he found out an awful lot. He went back about 400 or 500 years in our family history and found out about all branches of our family. This, though, concerns my great-grandmother. And we refer to her as Mammy. The title, Mammy's Door, refers to her. And, of course, in the front of it, you have a map of the state of Alabama, terrain of the state, done in my brother's style. In the middle, you can see Montgomery, the state capital. A little bit up to the right, you can see my grandmother Brown's house in Opelika, Alabama. Above in the center is Birmingham, Alabama. And then the upper left shows Mamie's house. That's where they all grew up. Where she raised, the kids. My grandmother, she raised the kids because my grandfather had been killed in a car accident when my mother was 8 years old. So there's a lot of love for my great-grandmother, Mamie, because she was very dear to all of us, to the children and to the grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So the bottom part of it shows a boat, and that's very symbolic. Mamie also has a mirror. Show you what's reflected in the mirror. The back of the painting is the door of Mamie's house. It had a door like that with the Z structure frame on it. So it incorporated the Z into her name. You had Di, Z, Dizenia. And then there's some photographs. The top one shows her and her brother, a younger brother, and then the one below that shows her son, Clover, and Coralie, who he married. That was my grandfather and grandmother. And then the picture right here shows my brother as a young kid, I think about maybe 1.5 or 2 years old, in a Jeep that my father made. He made, put the wheels on it, cut it, put tin can headlights on it. He was very good with his hands. He made a car for me too when I was a kid. Remember, he made that out of grocery store shelves. He had some old grocery store shelves. And he went back in the meat market and cut it with his meat saw and put it like that. And that would be a picture. A shirt and a book was made by my great-grandmother. She made shirts for all of us. Grandkids had and grandchildren did. Had a mailbox in it which had a legend that told about the family history, the ancestry. And then we get to the mirror. The mirror on the floor shows underneath the water of Mobile Bay the shape of a guitar. In memory of Barbara Allen is written around the circular hole in the guitar. The reason for that is my great-grandmother would sit out on the porch swing and she would sing Barbara Allen, which is an old Irish folk ballad that had been passed down from generation to generation. And she would sing it in the Irish dialect, sing it very slowly, just the way Paul had sung hundreds of years ago. She did that for all the grandchildren. We remember that. Roger wrote those words down, so we have the words to it. That's what that's all about. There's an Irish ancestry. They preserved that over the years with the ballads and stories that they would tell. It had, on one side here, it had, the way he wrote it is kind of circular, concentric. You can read it. It tells the story of our ancestors. From Mammy all the way back to great-great-great-great-grandparents. On this side of it, you flip the side and you've got a legend that tells us the front part, the locations of the houses in the Capitol building, whatever. Legend. But you've also got history. Open, read it. How far to read it? And read it. So it's a very interesting piece. There's many levels on it. This one is an Alabama type name too. It's called Shannon Line, or Ode to Billie Jean. And I remember Shannon Line. It was a group of little houses in the poor part of town. Something like mill houses. very simply built, and there was a road called Shannon Line, and the houses built on the side of the old shotgun style. And they had a living room and a bedroom and a kitchen. That's about it. Billie Jean was my aunt. She was married to my Uncle Horace. The reason it's an ode, and I think Roger probably identified it with this because of George passing away with cancer in 1984. We kind of tied that into my Aunt Billie Jean, who also died of cancer. It was very sad. It drug on for a long time. It really broke my uncle's heart. He never really got over it. So I think, in a way, it's kind of an ode to the memory of her. Very symbolic. And some of the images in the window show, I think the top one shows some plasma hanging by the bedside as if someone were taking intravenous, plasma, being treated for cancer. Or some of the images probably relate to Billie Jean and her parents. It tells a story. A very intimate story associated with memories he had from his childhood that he was maybe re-experiencing death of George. Now, these are houses, you can read there, assorted homes of the type utilized by my forefathers. There's a shotgun house, a dog trot, a slab inn, log houses, and you've got them labeled here, so you can tell what's what. We did that today. Thank you, Lisa. So we would know which was which. The dog trot is a house that has an opening in the middle. So the dogs and the chickens and the goats and the cows or whatever can run right through the house. So it's like a breezeway. So you've got living quarters and a kitchen on the left. Of course, the log house is simply a log house. The slab inn was a type of red cedar that they split and stacked and pegged. And they were very strong, they were very thick and very durable. You just kind of Lincoln log it would be a good way to describe it. And they were notched on the end and had pegs that went down in them. Hold one on it, pegs in, put the next one on, put the pegs in, stack it up. Red cedar was good wood because it had a nice straight grain to it. It was easy to split. So it was very common in the 1700s. In fact, the next slide that we looked at was John Palmer's house. It was that type of house. The shotgun was a long, narrow house. I call it shotgun because it was like the barrel of a shotgun, long and narrow. And you had a living room, bedroom, kitchen, wall space underneath. They're very common in the South. Still see a lot of them in Montgomery, Alabama. Certain parts of town have that type of house. Grandmother had one. The others are, the same. Those dog trot slab in log house. Typical. And we remember them because we grew up with some of our relatives lived in very nostalgic house. It's a shotgun house. And I think he actually is representing my family. You see the silhouetted figure with the woman that has the bun on her head. Grandmother always wore hair like that. Never saw her in any other hair. I was 2 years old and she passed away. But that was her. That was grandmother. And then there's a bed in the second window. It could be my mother or my aunt in the kitchen, maybe preparing something. So she might be having a frying pan or something like that. That's typical for a shotgun house. Of course, you'd have steps in. So you'd have, probably out in the country, the chickens would be running, and cats, the farm animals would be running. You go out and feed the chickens and whatever. That is my great-grandfather's house, John Palmer. The John Palmer Homestead in South Carolina. You can read the information on it. Built around 1700s. We still had drawings of that. And I think when Roger was in his 20s, it was still standing. It was falling in, but it was still there. Lisa showed me today that the one piece of the timber is saved at the pegs. That's one of those slab ends. Red cedar. Split them and stack them up. That time up in South Carolina, future generations moved to Alabama. Let's go to the next one. Goats live there now. I see chimneys like this in the South. Houses that way. You may have had some similar reference to his ancestors. Nostalgic. And he was always proud of his Southern heritage. There you have larger, I think, leaves and trees. Very proud of it. If you look at the bottom, you can see the artist in his canvas, the smaller figure at the bottom, figure with the guitar, figure at his desk and his typewriter. We're all real proud of our Southern heritage. Sadly. There's some cousins. Here's the family history. Yes, it is true. Elvis Presley, my brother, and I came from the same great-great-great-great-grandmother. And her name was Mourning Dove White. That's Mourning Dove White, her husband. So one side of the family goes down, with the Palmer side, all the way to my mother and dad. And over here on Elvis's side, Mansells go down until finally Aaron marries Elvis's mother. So you check this out. No, it's true. There's actually a book written that had the information in it. I was surprised when I picked it up and read it that the ancestors are listed in the same as mine. Then it's kind of a hoot to find something out like that. Because that's a long way back. Not that much relation. It's interesting. It's fun to talk about. And there listed there. Mourning Dove White. There's Mary Dizenia, who was Mamie, Clover. It's my mother and dad. And then I came about 6.5 years later. And that pretty much is what I was going to show you.
Really interesting work that I admired for. And thank you for having me here to speak. I'm really excited to talk about this work. So, as Lisa mentioned, I primarily study Italian Renaissance art. The Roger Brown has been kind of a new artist for me to study, and really enjoyed looking at his stuff. Oh, yeah. So I was introduced to Roger Brown's work 2 years ago. Jason LaFountain was giving a lecture at the Roger Brown House, and during that lecture, he put up these slides. On the right, or on the left, sorry, you're looking at Giovanni di Paolo's St. John Retiring to the Desert. This is a 15th century panel painting, pretty small. It's below a predella. Now it's detached. That's easier for you. Oh. Oh, sorry. Is this better? Okay, so to catch you up, on the left, we have a 15th century panel painting by the Sienese artist Giovanni di Paolo. And on the right is Roger Brown's kind of adaptation, if you want to call it, of that small panel painting. From my perspective as an Italian Renaissance specialist, this was really fascinating because Giovanni di Paolo didn't really have any followers we know about. So this is pretty much the closest thing to a master copy or a follower that I've been able to find. And I thought about what we can gain by using kind of modern artists as a lens to look through at art at the past. And looking into Roger Brown's work a little bit further, I was pleased to find out this was not an isolated incident at all. In fact, it seems that Roger Brown spent a lot of time looking at Giovanni di Paolo's work and studying it. And this was an interest that kind of spanned most of his career. We have work here from 1971 through 1997, I think. So I became really interested in this story. How does a relatively unknown 15th century Sienese painter become to feature so prominently in the work of a 20th century painter in Chicago? And a lot of that story actually unfolds here at the School of the Art Institute. So Giovanni di Paolo is virtually absent from the historical record until 1866. So that's 400 years after he's an active artist. He's really not mentioned until that point. And then a few short years after that, connoisseurs and art historians, such as Bernard Berenson, start to take an interest and start nudging their collector friends to buy up these works of Giovanni di Paolo and the broader group he was a part of that we typically called the Italian primitives, which is works of art from Italy that predate this kind of high Renaissance moment we associate with artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. So I'm showing you here a view of Gallery 204 in the Art Institute of Chicago. This is part of the Ryerson collection. Ryerson was one of these collectors that took the advice of Berenson and bought up these works, ultimately bequested them to the Art Institute in the late 30s, and they're here today. And they were also here in 1963 when Roger Brown began as a student at the School of the Art Institute. And at that time, some of you might know, the classes were held in the museum building itself. So to study art history and studio art at the School of the Art Institute was really an immersive experience, and you were really engaging with art of the past as you were working through your own process. Then the Ryersons feature in once more in this story because in 1970, Roger Brown receives a Ryerson-funded travel grant to go to Italy for the first time. And it's on this trip that he sees a lot of new works in person, and he's beginning, I think, to expand his notion of what painting can be and what painting can do. And on that trip, this is a letter from while he's there, and I'll just read it. Those early artists, so Cranach and the Italian fresco painters, got a great deal of pleasure out of seeing city walls and buildings and towers, and then creating their own innumerable varieties on canvas. It's not all that important, but it does give me some new images and some new thoughts about painting. And something like this is probably the work he's looking at when he was writing that letter. And this is Ambrogio Lorenzetti's Allegory of Good Government fresco. It's from the 14th century, and it's in Siena. So whether or not he deemed these insights in his letter to be all that important at the time, when he comes back, he certainly seems to have developed some new images and some new ideas about painting. And this is from 1972, so this kind of a painting is a pretty big departure from the stuff he was making earlier in the late 60s. He's moving from these kind of typically smaller, centralized works in linear perspective to making these kind of kaleidoscopic cityscape landscapes at a monumental scale. And I think we can look at this as perhaps in dialogue with these earlier Renaissance works that he was looking at, and perhaps a response to them as well. And to my eye, I'm obviously biased because I see things primarily as someone who studies Renaissance art. I think these actually have a lot in common in the sense that they are doing similar things in similar ways. These are both cityscape, landscape composite images that feature multiple figures in a landscape. And they're using a similar set of compositional strategies to do that. So some of those include the use of isometric perspective. And what that is basically depicting space as a progression up the canvas rather than a recession into it. So the farther things are, they are still depicted in the same scale as maybe something in the foreground. And that's really different from linear perspective, which was something he experimented with a lot before this moment, wherein something far away is smaller and depicted in a way that it's much less legible to the viewer. An isometric perspective, too, is kind of characterized by this really high horizon line, which you probably noticed also in a lot of the images that Greg shared with us. Super high horizon line, you've got these patterned landscapes kind of tumbling, cascading down the canvas, and these geometric architectural elements. And one thing that I think is also connecting these two works thematically is that they're both giving this portrait of a place, right? And the way they're doing that is by showing us multiple spatial zones in a single place, connected by roads and people moving through them. In the case of the Lorenzetti fresco, you have this image of the city marked by buildings, and then you have these agricultural fields in the background that are the crops, the bounty of the city, and then beyond those you have these barren, empty fields or mountains that mark the wilderness. And so Lorenzetti's giving us an image of the outskirts of Siena and connecting it to the city through all these spatial registers. And I think Roger Brown is doing a kind of similar thing here in City and Suburbs from 1972. In the foreground, we have the cityscape. It's marked by skyscrapers and kind of overpasses. And then in the middle, you have these like Pete Seeger-looking little boxes, suburbia scene. And then in the background, you have these clover interchanges and billboards and a water tower kind of marking the rural environment. And again, those are all connected by roads and by the way our eye kind of follows those roads and connects the spaces together. Something else that I see in both of these is a really intense richness of detail. Both paintings reward a close, contemplative mode of looking, and every detail in them matters. And just to show that, I want to talk briefly about this minor background detail in City and Suburbs. You're looking at two semi-trucks. One is entering the canvas at the left, and the other is exiting it at the right. And what's interesting about these is they're kind of working in two ways. In one sense, they complete this circuit of movement through the painting, entering and exiting and asking you to kind of follow them and imagine them traversing the painting through those roads. But in the other sense, they call into question the temporality of this scene, because these could be two trucks, but they could also be the same truck depicted twice. And if they are the same truck depicted twice, as in a kind of serial narrative, how does that change the way we look at the rest of the image? He's playing a similar game with this in these paintings from a year earlier, or this one painting that's his, adapted from the Giovanni di Paolo painting, with the duplicated truck. So are these two trucks, are they scenery, like buildings or trees, or are they functioning as the protagonist of a story, like St. John the Baptist in Giovanni di Paolo's painting, who is figured twice, once leaving the city and second entering the wilderness? And what's interesting is that I think he doesn't want us to really know whether it's one or the other. It's this sense of ambiguity and mystery that's being cultivated in the use of such compositional tactics and narrative strategies. It gives a sense of mystery to the painting, and I use this word mystery because it's the word Brown used describing things that he admired in this kind of pre-Renaissance moment of art, such as Giovanni di Paolo. And I'll close with this quote of his. The Renaissance was essentially a move towards science, and hence a realistic depiction of space became highly valued.
But for me, the mystery began to go out of art at that point. And mystery is one of the most important things in art. That was also the point when religion began to go out of art. So maybe the mystery was religion. I've always believed our response to art and religion emanates from the same place. And just in closing, looking at these images, it seems to me that this pre-Renaissance moment that's exemplified by works like Lorenzetti's and Giovanni di Paolo gave Brown more than a model book of compositions to kind of lift out and use to his own terms. I think in those paintings, he's also recognizing the potential of figurative painting, of landscape scenery, buildings, and people, and the potential of that kind of imagery to create powerfully complex and enigmatic and mysterious works of art. And with that, I'll hand it over. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me, or should I use this, or is that too loud? This is okay? Chloe, I think you're absolutely right, by the way. He did use all those elements to create those levels of communication and meaning and so forth. I'm going to try to organize just a few thoughts about Brown around the sense of place, but a good deal more too. And I have to say, this is very personal for me. I met Roger Brown when I was a graduate student in 1975 and followed his work and wrote about his work and have thought about it a lot. I'm not sure I've thought about it well, but a few thoughts as they occurred to me as I was thinking about place and so much more that's layered in, I believe, to Brown's work. So on the left, you have one of his very early so-called theater paintings. And these had to do with very much maybe his memories from childhood of his childhood theater. It may have had to do with gay porn places in Chicago as he's a young man exploring the world of Chicago. He didn't say that, but it's possible, I think. But I wanted to show you the one on the right to show you how aware he was of other art. I mean, we've seen Giovanni di Paolo. There's a good starting point. The Magritte, obviously a kind of source for the silhouettes, but also look at that kind of aura on the horizon. That occurs in almost all the Browns, and there it is in the Magritte. Chicago Imagism, of which he was a part, has always been sort of treated, again, sort of discounted as an amalgam of pop and surrealism. I think that's, in fact, partially true, but it's also so much more. The surrealist influence shows up here, another early painting. He's now moved out of the theater and onto the block, if you will. And it can't help but make you think of Giorgio de Chirico's piazzas and those sharp perspectives and long shadows, and I think certainly Brown was looking at those things. And then this one, he's moved from the block to the neighborhood, if you will. And of course, Nighthawks right there in the Art Institute, and that I certainly think the imagery on the left of the Brown painting is a homage to Hopper. This is a painting I particularly wanted to bring on the left, Miami Causeway, because Roger gave it to his parents. And it was actually Greg and I have talked about this a lot. It was a memory of their honeymoon in Miami. But what I wanted to point out is the couple in the lower right, which Greg has a photograph, the photograph of his father that he took of his mother on that honeymoon. And that's sort of them appearing, we think, in the lower right. And so, although the silhouettes appeared a little earlier than than this painting, I think the women were always his mother, you know, with her sort of 40s hairstyle. It always starts with the mother, you know. And he expanded out from the block in the neighborhood to the suburbs on the right, and used something that he used a lot to build space. I agree about isometric perspective, but there's something that I call alternating perspective. He moves first this way, then that, trying to build your knowledge of the space without showing it in single point perspective. And by the way, the theater is still there. It just happens to be the drive-in now. City and suburbs. He's taken the city view and the suburbs and made them into one vast landscape. And he's used that alternating perspective, first one way, then the other, to make a kind of pattern that he certainly was aware of from folk art, quilts, but a way to build space. So he's taken our modernist ideas of both suggesting space and flatness and so forth, and built it into a very complex system in that painting. The one on the right is the skyscrapers again, but as a kind of fantastic disaster, a kind of fantasy disaster. It doesn't look too serious. In fact, it looks even a little comic. But he's sort of playing, there was always a sense of foreboding, a kind of unease in Brown's paintings. Here he builds it to the disaster level, but in a kind of playful way, I think. And then he moved out into the great American landscape. He was traveling a lot at this time, the early 70s, traveling across the country, driving trips that he and George Veranda would make. And the painting on the left is one of those vistas, but one that interestingly I think owes a great deal to an artist that he admired, Grant Wood. And I think Brown was very much after the same thing Wood was after, the, capital The, American landscape, somehow getting to that core of what landscape meant in America. And it was an exploration that I think, continued for much of his career. And then there's this. Buttermilk Sky, 1974. Clearly his homage, I think, to Georgia O'Keeffe, the O'Keeffe again at the Art Institute. So it shows you how much he was aware of art history, but how personal that awareness was. These were the paintings down the hall. Oh, and I want to mention one thing before I leave this. He did a painting, actually, Lisa would know what date, of his sort of artist heroes. And they were Thomas Hart Benton, Georgia O'Keeffe, Marsden Hartley, and Diego Rivera, which is kind of interesting, I think, the political aspect. And then this is my own particular theory. I think he got a big giggle out of playing on American modernist abstraction. This painting on the left, Estate and Fall with Cows and Bulls, I think is Frank Stella. On the right, I think it's Mark Rothko. And not only does he play with the compositional elements of those painters, but he turns Rothko's, and I take it quite seriously, but I'm going to call it sort of existential angst, into The Skies Are Not Cloudy All Day, through this kind of classic Americana song. That's just one of the examples, I think, of so many layers going on at the same time in Brown's work. And then, of course, there's always Chicago. The entry of Christ into Chicago in 1976, obviously based on the Ensor painting of the entry of Christ into Brussels. And not only is there all the formal complexity there, but his political antennae are up. There's Christ on the right, sort of against that, with the aura of the window behind him, riding into Chicago on a flatbed truck, which seems maybe a little more Opelika than Chicago, but nonetheless, there it is. But he's going up to the reviewing stand on the left, and there's, the band playing and Cardinal, whomever he was at that time, and there's the first Mayor Daley and city officials. He sort of was having a little fun with the Chicago political structure. In the right, he's just playing with the formal structure of that painting, turning the city here into a kind of op art experience, if you will. And we called this talk Lake Effects. That's actually the painting Lake Effect from 1980 on the left. In 1978, he moved to New Buffalo, Michigan. George Veranda built a house for them there, and the painting suddenly takes on a more lyrical aspect. So looking back at Chicago, that Chicago skyline, with the patterns of weather and light that he so often did, and maybe a touch of Kenneth Nolan too. On the right, Memory of Sand Hill Cranes. It has certainly that lyrical effect. It looks like a Japanese screen, which he probably was quite aware of. But it's the beginning of his sort of ecological interest. I mean, at that time, there was the thought that the Sand Hill Cranes were disappearing. So there's a political aspect, the ecological. We've talked about these elements before. But the one on the left is one of the most extraordinary. Actually based on the IRA bombings in Europe, in England, in the 1980s, the early 1982. It's called IRA PLO FLAN. I don't even remember what FLAN was, but you get the idea. The extraordinary thing about that painting is that it looks back to his sort of fanciful disaster paintings, that we saw from 1972, but it's obviously based on real events at the time, and it's, of course, incredibly prescient in that it's painted 19 years before 9/11. It's interesting how often his current events paintings or his political paintings sort of make us think later how perceptive he was. On the right, he's really just playing a formal play with his own paintings, all the cloud paintings and patterns and so forth, with the clouds buffeting Chicago here. And in these paintings, going into the 90s, it's what I would call an almost sociological interest. The mallization of America with Walmarts and intersections. I mean, it's been paved over. And on the right, talk show addicts, people sort of isolated in their houses with their televisions. I often think, too, what Roger would do with what's going on today. I mean, what would he do with all of us at our computer screens, sort of isolated from each other? And I really wonder what he would do with Trump. And talking about place, finally, the last place that he moved to, at least for part of the year, was California, about 1990. Lisa, is that right? Am I about right? Anyway, on the left, winter storm, a storm over the Pacific. And again, always that foreboding quality. Although my argument is that this is sort of his homage to the 19th century Hudson River School, those vast skies. But on the right, a specific disaster, this landslide that actually occurred in the town that he lived in, La Conchita, on the coast of California near Santa Barbara. And then finally, Burned Hills on the left is the last painting that was left in the studio at the time of his death. And it certainly owes formally, Lisa, I have to thank Lisa for the comparison on the right. This Marsden Hartley painting is again in the Art Institute. And I was going to compare this painting to George O'Keeffe's Black Place, where the palette is very similar, but both work. But the fact is that it's a formally complex painting, a narratively complex painting, a playful in a certain way. It's about a disaster, but yet we're always talking about, oh, those Californians, and they face those fires, you know, every year. And he has it, yes, from May to October. But it is a painting that very much tries to, I think, capture again this essence of America. And all of his paintings, I think, layer these very complex, formal, historical, social, political, religious, on and on. Roger Brown, I think, has been dismissed in a way. Sometimes from the Chicago canon, certainly from the national or international canon, because the work seems so simple. These simple elements repeated again, these stories told. I think that's not quite accurate, and I think these layers of complexity are ones that we need to learn to read. And I hope that someday soon there's going to be a Roger Brown retrospective. The last one was at the Hirshhorn in 1987, and a monograph. Maybe Chloe will do it. In any case, there's so much more to be learned. He has really so much more to tell us. Thank you.
So, thank you, everybody. I really also want to thank Jessica Campbell at Kavi Gupta Gallery for bringing in, and she curated this panel of very diverse people with really different perspectives on Roger Brown's work. And the lights are just blasting us in the face. And I'd like to mention also that Kavi Gupta's team is beginning to work on a monograph that will hopefully be published at the end of 2017. So they're piling into that project, which is very exciting. So I think I'll kind of skip around. I'm going to ask each panelist a question, and then we'll get to audience questions. Chloe, I was wondering if you could talk about the ideological component of Brown's interest in the Italian primitives, especially given their marginal or marginalized status, and Brown's feeling that he was, and Chicago artists were kind of marginalized from as a figurative painter in Chicago from modes that were in vogue at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Italian primitives that he was interested in have typically kind of been understood as a precursor to the big Renaissance moment that we talk about in textbooks, this mastery of art over nature. Perspective is a big part of that, being able to convert the visual realm into a purely artistic object. And these artists that preceded that, artists like Giovanni di Paolo, did something very different. Brown saw them as artists that were dedicated to painting images from nature, from life, scenes of their everyday experience. Whether or not that's really what they were doing, that's how he was perceiving their work. And I think he must have felt some kind of affinity to that, because in a similar way, he was calling for kind of a seriousness of that kind of painting in his own moment, when in New York, which was sort of the avant-garde center of that moment, it was all about art being about art. So these abstract expressionist paintings being about, the limits of painting and how they can relate to human experience. But he wanted to paint people and things and scenery, and he felt that that was just as legitimate and just as serious and complex as these other more avant-garde modes. And I think that kind of affinity of really finding an avant-garde way to paint the mundane and to paint the scenes from everyday life was something that he talked about. And he says specifically about the Sienese provincials, I guess we could call them, that they painted things from the outdoors, they painted stones, buildings, whatever, but they certainly changed the course of Western painting. And that's a quote from him. And I think he really believed that and felt that his own work could do a similar thing, could appeal to the everyday experience and make it grand and important and complex.
He also took it a step further in a painting that we didn't see tonight called Giotto in Chicago. And he sets up Chicago art critics, Alan Artner and Franz Schulz, against, he's looking at Siena and Florence and Chicago and New York. It's also very narrative, sequential media. That's what we call comics now, right?
Yeah,
and really starts ripping into it, and which also started his intense focus in a number of paintings up through 1993 of critique of Chicago art critics and art criticism. So I guess he got his start in the Italian primitives and kept on rolling.
Yep.
So, and Greg, I wanted to ask you, it's been puzzling to me for a while that Brown is, by 1990, he's a very successful artist. He's been making his living as a serious studio artist. He's, by that time, in many major collections. He's a so-called famous artist. And then, there were the paintings from 84 and 87, but then in 1990 really starts digging into the vernacular architecture of Alabama. And I'm wondering if there's something at that point in his life that you're aware of, maybe some undercurrent of why he would then essentially go home in that way and do these paintings that are really, really serious investigations. If you all read the title of the old John Palmer Homestead, it's about 6 lines long. He wants to get the narrative, the history down.
I think number one was I need to get the microphone. Number one.
They'll count on me. Here we are.
All right, number one, he was very aware of his own mortality. He knew it was HIV. In 1984, George Veranda passed away with tuberculosis. He lost his greatest love in life, and that would be enough to depress a person terribly for the rest of their life. And then, the circumstances with the HIV and having to deal with that, with the atmosphere the way it was in this country at that time was very difficult. And why not be drawn back to home, to security, to the people that love you, to the subject matter that you remember as a child when you were happy, when you felt secure, when you felt your whole life was ahead of you. You go back. You go back to that subject matter. And so you have autobiography, The Shape of Alabama. You have Shannon Land, which is a painting that related to my Aunt Billie Jean. You have several, things that, the ancestral, kissing cousins. I believe it was that. I think it was somehow comforting to him. And that would be my take on it.
Well, it's interesting because he was then going back and really expressing important things about the place of his childhood and home, even though he went back every year. But he also kept moving forward, and the closer he moved to the end of his life, he started designing homes and studios and gardens for other places and even buying property for them, which would never be realized. And that is quite amazing. And then you were telling us this afternoon, I mean, there's a lot of coding in Brown's work. You can look at them, as Russell mentioned, on the surface, and because of the style he developed and perfected, they can appear to be one-dimensional, simple, simplistic, etc. But at closer readings, there are lots of dimensions and layers. So he did this painting called Kissin' Cousins, which Greg showed, and am I allowed to say this? Yeah? Okay, and so I'm not sure if I'm going into waters with sharks, because this is being recorded. Anyway, this afternoon we're looking at and talking about the Kissin' Cousins painting, which I've always thought was just pretty straightforward, sideshow, freak show, banner style painting about the fact that Roger discovered he was related to Elvis Presley. He and Greg and his whole family. Pretty big deal. And Greg said, no, it's not about that.
Okay, so to Lisa's surprise, and probably to a lot of other people's surprise, his Kissin' Cousins was my great-grandmother and her cousin. And because of the Kissin' Cousins, Clover was born. And so he was the product of two first cousins. And so it is literally Kissin' Cousins. And that's something a whole lot of my family likes to talk about. And I'm kind of a renegade in that sense. But my Uncle Horace, who is now passed away, and I talked about it quite a bit, and my Uncle Harry, who is now passed away also a long time ago. But yes, if you look at the painting, on the right side of it, I believe, you see my mother and my father. Above them, you see Clover and Coralie, and above them, you see Dazenia all by herself. And that's why. It ain't because Elvis and Roger were kissing cousins.
Well,
But
we don't know about that anyway. But you mentioned they did find a marriage certificate, which is also interesting.
another thing, though, I wanted to mention is you asked why the change of subject matter. Is they was doing an awful lot of research, family history, had done so for 30 years. And he was revisiting a lot of these subjects, the structure of houses. He was finding things out. And I'm sure that fit into the subject matter as well, the research that he was doing.
Thank you. So Russell, you and Chloe both have shown how intentionally Roger referenced and incorporated aspects of the history of art into his work throughout his whole career. Even though you both delved deeply into it, you scratched the surface of that subject. And in doing so, Brown really positioned himself in the, intentionally in the grand arc of art history. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, and if that was completely kind of not done at the time, or not part of the trends, or how Brown was perceived by doing that.
Well, I think that he was certainly perceived in the 70s, when he was really making his reputation, by the way, beyond Chicago, nationally and even internationally, as a bit of an outlier, if you will. I mean, he was figurative, he was narrative, he was telling stories, he was complex when others were simple, at least formally. And so I think he always was certainly perceived at that time as a bit of an outlier in American art history. It's interesting how much that art history has come back to embrace some of the things he was interested in: figuration, narrative, pattern. We could go on and on. So I think that's maybe less true today than it was in the mid-'70s, when it was seen as, you know, Chicago versus New York, or vice versa. What I think there, I sort of ended on the note that there's still so much to be learned. I mean, I think Chloe's absolutely right. He uses the elements that go back to Renaissance painting, go back to folk art, for example. I think his interest in folk art, he wanted to tell the stories of, you know, the big disaster, the big flood, the big what, in the same elemental way that they wanted to tell those stories. And he did those things, and then he added on all of the other layers of history, meaning, politics, religion, humor, and I think people are beginning to perceive that now, that he was a much more complex and meaningful artist than maybe it was thought in the 70s.
I think we have time for a couple of questions.
I want to thank all of you for your talks. They're super interesting. I have a question that was mostly spurred by the comparison that Chloe showed between the Lorenzetti and the Brown painting. But this also came up for me looking at the Christ entry to Chicago, just thinking about the scale of human figures in these paintings. I mean, clearly he's playing with scale in super interesting ways in all of these images. But the humans so rarely are large, to put it bluntly. Like, there's small sort of bit players in the narrative that goes on. And if we're thinking about narrative configuration, I just wonder if you could talk about that.
But it allowed him to get more figures in. But it's interesting, you know, he'll always flip everything, and later in the, I would say, the paintings of the 80s, there is a whole series of paintings where the silhouettes are very large, and he reverses it and makes the landscape behind them very small. So he's always toying with those notions in an interesting way.
I would add to that. What I find so interesting about the way he uses figures in these kind of larger cityscape landscapes is even these minute people in the windows, if you take any kind of detail of that painting and look at it in its own kind of isolated form, there's a story there. And as soon as you zoom back out, the entire thing is complicated again because you think you understand what's going on, and then you realize this is just one figure of 35, and they really don't cohere into any single narrative. And to me, that's really interesting because his style gets compared a lot to comics, where you have this kind of serial progression of narrative. Even if the figures are repeated, they're moving in one direction. He's not doing that. Every time you see a figure and figure them out, and then you back up, the whole painting means something different. So I think that's very deliberate in a lot of ways, especially with these smaller figures in windows or kind of seen afar. That's been the way I've been looking at it.
Another thing is, Russell mentioned he was toying, as if to play with toys, as if remembering childhood and remembering those little plastic soldiers that we used to play with, and those little buildings that we would build and have Lionel trains and cars and everything. And they give you a certain feeling of power and authority. And you're placing these figures like chess pieces throughout the painting. So that could be part of the approach too.
And then maybe on another way to look at that is, especially in something like Burned Hills, but lots of other paintings with grand scenes, whether they're natural or urban, with small figures, especially at the horizon, at the ground plane, excuse me. There's a sense of there's always something larger than a sort of than the human dimension, that the human enterprise is being dwarfed by something much larger. Sometimes they take on a very spiritual quality, and sometimes it's just that there's something a lot huger than us out there. So, anyone else have any questions for the panel? And if not, please come back to, or don't come back here, go to Kavi Gupta on 219 Elizabeth Street on Saturday, November 5th for a wonderful and very different kind of presentation. David Getze will be speaking with others. And in closing, I'd like to thank Jessica Campbell for organizing all of the panel discussions and making little booklets about them, and Kavi's whole staff and speakers. Thanks very much.